School of Public Health. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you so much to Leora and the Berkeley Population Center for sponsoring this event. Yay! We are thrilled today to have Berk Ozler, I'm hoping I'm doing a Turkish pronunciation of his name appropriately, with us, sorry, he'll have to say his name correctly for you, with us here from the World Bank. He was trained at Cornell in economics and has worked for more years than he cares to remember at the World Bank. He writes for a really popular blog, Development Impact, which you should all check out. It's great. It's fantastic. And he is going to be talking about differential effects of conditional and unconditional cash transfers for adolescents on future outcomes. Following his talk, we'll have 3 panelists, each of whom will present for about 10 or 15 minutes. We have Minnis talking about Yo Puedo, which is a cash transfer intervention in San Francisco. Then we have Ahna Suleiman, who will be talking about a case study on motivation and learning, and CCT is an adolescent contraceptive update. And finally, we'll have McCoy, who will be talking about cash transfers for strengthening HIV care and treatment. So finally, we'll have Ozer, who's a professor in the School of Public Health too, moderating a discussion about cash transfers and behavior change. So without further ado, Berk, we're very much looking forward to your talk. Thank you so much for being here.
All right. Thanks very much. It's always fun to come to Berkeley. My 2 co-authors, who are not from Malawi, they both went to school here in graduate school, Craig McIntosh and Sarah Berk. So I'm quite familiar with this campus. But it's also a pleasure to give a talk to a full room. Like Eventbrite said, this event was sold out. Last month I gave a talk on a broader kind of cash transfers talk at the World Bank. And it was standing room only, I think because one of my colleagues tweeted beforehand saying, Berk's wearing a suit. Which is a never-before-seen spectacle at the World Bank, so it was quite crowded. But I'm hoping I can actually return the favor. This is a kind of very new work. In fact, Craig was in DC visiting Sarah and I, who also happens to be my partner in life, to write this paper. So it's very new work. So it's not as polished as I like my talks to be, but I'm hoping there'll be some good discussion afterwards. And do stay for the panel, because I've seen all the titles and the abstracts. It looks wonderful. I'm looking forward to it more than my own. So last night I was in my hotel room watching PBS NewsHour, and John Irving was on about his latest book. It's about a kid who, what is it? Children of the rubbish, he calls them, like a kid growing up in Mexico, all the way to old age. And then he was saying that I've always believed that if something traumatic or calamitous enough happens to a kid at a formative age, they'll make him or her the adult that they become, right? So is that I don't have the power, to wave a magic wand and make our adolescent girls' lives change. But that was exactly the idea why we started this project. The question really was a short-term, kind of 2-year cash transfer program delivered at a very key transitional period in these females' lives in Malawi. Can it have a lasting impact on their lives? Can we change their life trajectory just by really supporting them for 2 years? Right? So that was in 2007. When we started asking this question, and then we raised some funds, and we actually set up this experiment completely on our own. This wasn't a World Bank project or anything like that. I raised the money myself to give to the girls. And by 2011, we had some pretty good results on kind of what happened during and immediately after this 2-year program. And it was quite eye-popping, because as you'll see, there's a lot of good things that happened. So then here now, in 2015, we start answering the question, that main question of sustained effects. And I only say we start answering because now those girls who were on average about 16 years old at baseline now are at this follow-up, they're 21, 22. In Malawi, that means some of them are still in school. So I can't actually say that these people are really now adults and the schooling life is completely over. I can look at all sorts of things without selection effects and things like that. But at least it's a start. We can see 2 years after the cessation of support what kinds of things are going on with their lives. So And with apologies, that means that some of you will be very familiar, maybe a few of you in the room, with our work previously, so that will be boring. But for others, I can't really present the new work without going over the old work, right? So I'll have to actually summarize first, which will take about 15, 20 minutes. And that stuff would have been actually the topic of like an hour and a half seminar itself, right? So you'll have a little bit hard time actually keeping up. It's like, oh, that happened, why did it happen, etc. But there's just no other way I can do this talk that I'm aware of, right? So I'm sure I can improve. So the way I'm setting it up, like these days, we used to, when we presented these results in 2011, we really focused on just the adolescent girls literature. Like we really said, okay, there's cash transfers literature, and they're kind of conditional and unconditional cash transfers. They're very straightforward, a la, let's say, Progressa or Bolsa Familia, etc., that maybe you might be familiar with, mostly governmental, small, monthly, conditional cash transfer programs. And then there's adolescence, and that was the intersection. But since then, the landscape has changed immensely, right? There's like this huge amount of enthusiasm about cash transfers in general, and you might regularly see in outlets like Foreign Affairs or Economist or The Atlantic, etc., give poor people cash, right? And it's gotten completely confusing. So the talk that I gave a month ago was trying to bring some sense to this world where when people say give people cash, what are they really talking about? Like, what kinds of modes of cash transfers are they talking about? More importantly, what's the goal of this cash, right? So the enthusiasm comes from these types of studies where people are giving lump sum cash grants, I would call them, rather than cash transfers, like big amounts of money at one go to various groups of people, right? With different aims. Like, so this, for example, these ones are these graduation approach people talk about. You give people goats, you give them support, etc., blah, 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 you know, and then you see lots of effects. There's a paper that gives cash grants to farmers in Mali. There's a famous Blattman, Fiala, and Martinez paper that kind of gives cash grants conditional on people submitting a proposal to, you know, you're youth unemployed in northern Uganda, you form a group of 10 people, and you say, you know, we want to get training in like welding, and then we're going to use the money to go get metal welding skills, and then also we're going to buy physical capital to start a business, right? They show that 4 years later, there's almost 100% increases in earnings and things like that, particularly for women, etc. And then there's some work on enterprises. But you might imagine now, like all these things that I used to work on, and then you're going to hear in this panel, those conditional cash transfer programs bear like almost no similarity to these kinds of programs at all. But when people yell, give people cash, which then spills over into the adolescent world and the conditional cash transfer world, these are the studies that they're hearing about, without reading much more than a few sentences in the abstract. Right? So then, kind of, you got to start thinking, for any intervention with a fixed duration to have a sustained effect after the cessation of support, it needs to lead to some increase in the stock of some asset, at least one, that will keep producing returns, right? So this could be health, this could be education, it could be something else. And so, for example, in those kinds of programs that I was talking about, you know, the one that in Northern Uganda I just talked about, these people invested both in vocational things, skills and productive assets, and then they had actually businesses that were making more money than the counterfactual control group without access to this credit, right? You know, Give Directly gives like just helicopter drops like $1,500 on like people with like non-tin roofs, like thatch roofs in Kenya. You know, they show that, you know, for example, the mechanism there might be people get the money, they might consume a lot of it, but they invest some of it in kind of like productive assets, right? And such as livestock and things like that, and then they start earning a stream from like dairy products and things like that. Or, you know, if you think about more like the stereotypical conditional cash transfers, like Mexico's, Paul Gertler here and a couple of co-authors showed that after 5.5 years, agricultural households were actually able to just save little by little to improve their productivity a little bit, to actually see that like after 5.5 years, compared to people who just started 4 years ago, they were having significantly higher consumption, and that couldn't have happened if they didn't build up something. It's not just coming from the fact that they're still getting cash. They actually built up something.
Or actually, Bianchi and Matteo Bova have a nice paper that says actually, you know what, we don't think so much that it's actually little investments in agriculture. These kinds of cash transfers have an insurance aspect. So because I know for years to come I will have this money, I can take more risks. So people actually start more risky entrepreneurial activities, and high risk, high return, they make some more money, right? So now, essentially, I want to take those kind of mechanisms, and then I want to think about, how do I think about a cash transfer program for adolescent girls in Malawi? Where is this sustained effect going to come from, right? So in that case, obviously, the first thing we're going to think is going to be human capital accumulation, either in education or health. So the kind of like the advantage of the study here is that we're in this setting where we've experimented randomly with having cash transfers just given completely unconditionally versus conditional on school attendance. But now there's a pure control group that never gets treated, right? So ad infinitum, I will have this control group that I can always compare to in the future. And so essentially, there are two other experiments just like ours that came out after. One is in Burkina and one is in Morocco. They only have 2-year follow-ups, and they only are really looking at schooling outcomes, right? And then there are a few studies that measure the longer-term impacts of CCTs. Most of them are like the ones that I mentioned. These are the kind of outcomes and the target groups they're interested in. They're always kind of comparing people who've been treated 8 years versus 10 years, or 5.5 years versus 4 years, depending on what the delay mechanism was. This is the only paper where it was a conditional cash transfer program in Nicaragua that actually started and stopped, that has a pure control group. The authors come back and then look at cognition among children at age 6, 2 years after the support completely ceased. Right? So it's fairly rare that, I think it is worth spending money on to kind of say, well, this adolescent girl group now, they're really young females, a lot of them are married, a lot of them are children, what's happening in their lives? Right? So thinking specifically about Malawi, it's really a place like Zomba, this study setting that we have, has not changed in the 10 years that I've been going there. Even neighboring, not neighboring, but nearby Uganda, they've almost had their like $1 a day poverty in 10 years or so. It's barely budged in Malawi. Really not much is going on there. So, Schultz, for example, has a seminal paper for Progressa. He looks at short-term effects of Progressa, and then he kind of like simulates what kinds of wage increases that we can expect in the future based on kind of Minserian wage regressions, the relationship between higher education and earnings. There's no such mechanism in Malawi that I can think of. These girls aren't even going to kind of get up and go to Lilongwe and get a better job, because Lilongwe even doesn't look that much different than Zomba, right? So unless we're talking international migration or something like that, that avenue is going to be mostly shut, right? So then where is it going to come from? It is possible that either the transfers, which are small as you'll see in a moment, 2 years, maybe you can save a little bit to kind of invest in something, fertilizer, etc., blah, or the human capital that you gain maybe is useful for agricultural activities, which is mostly subsistence, either that channel, or maybe you become kind of like more of an entrepreneurial person. Those are going to be the main channels towards increased earnings, so to speak, for the young female, right? Improved outcomes in other fields herself might mainly come from actually getting a better husband or something like that. So there's going to be health improvements if we have delayed marriage, delayed fertility, etc., lower HIV, all of which I'll show you happen in the short run. They may get better quality marriages. They may be more kind of empowered in their marriages. They might have more intra-household bargaining power. They may be better off that way, right? And then finally, this is actually the one that we're most enamored about, but least can identify, is actually the cash transfers can have an effect on their own children, right? So this is very different than evaluations of Progressa say. When we're thinking of Progressa, we're thinking of 16-year-old girls, but we're really following her parents' household, right? So when people say like cash transfers have no negative effects on like, for negative meaning, unintended consequences on fertility and things like that, they're actually talking about our study sample's parents, right? But actually our study sample are having babies. By 2012, we had 2,000 babies in our sample, right? In the beginning, there were very few. So cash transfers actually can help the outcomes of those children as well. So I'm actually going to talk a little bit about that at the end. So what did we do? We called it school income and health risks, just because that was kind of what it was about. Like the CCT was about schooling, and then the UCT was about income. And then actually the ultimate outcomes that I was initially really interested in were like sexually transmitted diseases. So we didn't want to tip our hands with HIV, so we just said health risks. So it's a cluster randomized cash transfer experiment. Has two arms, conditional on cash transfers, monthly cash transfers, conditional on school attendance, and then unconditional cash transfers where we just told people, you won a lottery, you'll receive monthly transfers of X dollars for the next 2 years, regardless of what you do. And then there are these two strata that I'll analyze everything separately for, baseline schoolgirls and baseline dropouts. This is important because the conditional cash transfer really is defined the same way, but means vastly different things to these two groups. People who are baseline dropouts, some of them had not been in school for like 2-3 years. We're essentially telling them, if you go back to school, you get this money, right? The other people, they're already in school, they're in like 7th, 8th grade, whatever, etc. And as you'll see, most of them, even without this intervention, will go on to finish, let's say, junior secondary school or something like that. It's just an inframarginal transfer, right? So we're giving them money to do something they would already be doing anyway, for most of them, right? So it's going to be quite different, kind of like the psychic and financial and otherwise costs of going back to school rather than staying in school. And I'll show you descriptives of these two groups. They look very, very different. You know, baseline schoolgirls have like no pregnancies at baseline and things like that, whereas baseline dropouts, half of them had a baby already. They're much more likely to come from female-headed households, way poorer, they're older, all this kind of stuff. Right? So we did the program for 2 school years in 2008 and 2009. And then we did a 1-year follow-up in 2009, 2-year follow-up in 2010, just after the cash transfer stopped. And then we did a 4.5-year follow-up around 2012. So, I'd say 3 modest contributions to the literature. One is to kind of essentially have this longer-term outcomes in the context of this experiment. And what we've done is we've really broadened the outcome set. In fact, I mean, it might almost look a little bit like fishing, so we did a pre-analysis plan, but we really couldn't get ourselves to say, no, we're just going to look at 3 important outcomes. Because we couldn't come up, I mean, I've been involved in other adolescent studies, and there's not a lot of stuff that's like panel that goes a long time and actually looking at really broad set of outcomes. You know, if we're public health people, we may be interested in certain outcomes there. Economists are interested in other things, yet people who do IPV are interested in other things, but nobody really collects like all of them together. We said, we don't care if people say, oh, you looked at too many things, therefore by chance you're getting effects. We're going to look at all of them. And then if it hurts us in the publication market, we don't care. Right? So we have lots and lots of, you can see our surveys, there's like 20, 30 sections. Right? The second thing that's important to note, I think, as I mentioned before, is that unlike a progressa, we're actually tracking the girl. Right? So when she gets married and forms her own household, that's who we go after, and we leave her old household behind. Right? So what that's going to allow me to do, and actually, you know, the trade-off there, is that if you think of these kinds of anti-poverty programs, they have 3 main goals. Right? The first one is the safety net goal. Right? I'm just trying to give you a consumption floor so that you don't go hungry and you don't do all the other things that you don't want to do to not go hungry. Right? The second one is intergenerational, kind of like a breaking of the poverty trap. Right? I'm actually investing in the children in these households so that when they grow up, they will not be as poor as their parents, but I don't really care that much about their parents' household other than the safety net aspect of it. Right? And the third goal is, I actually want the parents' household to get out of poverty, not now, but pretty soon, before they die. Right? Like 5 years, 10 years, or something like that. So those are promotion programs. Right? So that's where kind of like I try to kind of like clarify the field by saying, okay, each type of program we can analyze with respect to these 3 goals. And some of them that are very good at one are going to be very bad at others, and vice versa. So here, I can do 1 and 2. but I cannot do 3 because unlike, let's say, in the Gertler, Martinez, and Rubio and Kodia paper, I can't just say, did the parents save some of the money each month and invest in something, and then now they're better off, because I actually don't see half of them in the 4th round of data collection. Right? Finally, we expand the study sample to actually include the beneficiaries' children and husbands, and we collect a whole lot of data on them as well. So we actually have on the children, we don't have biomarkers because people don't like their little ones getting poked. So we have like anthropometric measures, we have child assessments like SDQs and things like that. We have parental practices. And then we have husbands. The husbands, we have a fair amount of data. Not only we know their whole characteristics, but we did a VCT with them. And then we actually gave them a Raven's colored progressive matrices test to see their kind of like cognitive ability. Okay. So we're interested in what this program does to the quality of the children and the quality of their husbands and their kind of like marriages. Okay. So the preview of results. Pause. It's also now becoming apparent to me that there's no way I'm going to get to the end. But we'll see.
Or 10.
I might have to rush.
You have 35 minutes.
Oh no. Okay. So CCTs led to large and durable improvements in human capital, mainly schooling, among this disadvantaged subgroup. That's a typo. I just wrote that this morning. That's why. It's baseline dropouts, right? So among the baseline dropouts, which were really just 15% of our target population. So we have a target population of 13 to 22-year-old never married females at baseline. So if you go to Malawi and then ask them, are you in school, are you not in school? We listed all of them in all these villages. So we have the universe of these girls in each village, right? 15% of them are they've dropped out of school, but they're not yet married. And you can understand that. Like, these things are so fast, the transition in Malawi, that the girl who dropped out of school but isn't yet married is a very rare event, right? But among them, we were so successful in re-enrolling them back in school compared to the control group that not only they have huge improvements in school attainment 4 years later, it has all sorts of knock-on effects on delayed marriage and fertility, including actually their total fertility and desired fertility are also down. So we can actually see that their lifetime number of babies is going to be lower, is our best guess, right? But despite those, like I said, because of, I think mainly because of the conditions in Malawi, no improvements in employment, wages, earnings, or something like that, no improvements in skills that would be related to agriculture or entrepreneurship, and actually no improvements in empowerment, despite the fact that they were significantly more likely to get more educated husbands with secondary school degrees, compared to the control group. And husbands with secondary school degrees in Malawi is not a common thing. Like, there's a big improvement there, right? But despite that, we're not actually seeing increases in per capita consumption or anything like that. So UCTs, they didn't really have any effects on schooling, even kind of during the program, like let alone after the program. Anything that was there kind of disappeared very quickly, but they had the advantage, and I'll show you in a second, on delaying marriage, delaying pregnancy, and then reducing HIV, much more than the conditional cash transfer group among baseline schoolgirls, right? They had improved mental health and all of that. We saw all of them vanish within 2 years. And I say within 2 years, but we actually think they vanished much earlier, right? I have actually some histograms showing you like birth months of babies after the program stops. You'll see it's very, very clear. In addition, delaying marriage without accumulating some human capital may have actually hurt, because this is a context like a lot of other places in the world where there's a premium on young bride age, right? So if you actually get older, but you don't have anything else that's valuable in the marriage market, your price goes down. Like, so if this was Bangladesh, your parents would be paying more dowry. Here, there's no dowry, so they're just getting lower quality husbands. And then we see some possible durable impacts on children born during the program. I know this always causes laughter. Yeah. There is such a thing as heterogeneity among our quality, believe it or not. So, yes, like I said, study takes place in Zomba. My co-authors are always enamored with maps, so this is kind of where we were. You can be driving up the main road in Malawi, and then if you just cross the fields of the main road, you'll be in Mozambique to both sides. It's a very nice place. Like I said, our target group was 13 to 22-year-old never married females. We had about 175 enumeration areas, and we kind of divided them ex ante into these two strata. And then, because this is a really small group, we couldn't get enough statistical power to do a conditional, unconditional cash transfer experiment here. And we honestly weren't too hopeful that, girls who'd been out of school for 3 years, if they just got $10 a month, they just by themselves go to school. So there's no experiment there. And that's a limitation. Like you'll see 4 years later, I would like to actually know in this group what would have happened, because we're seeing such massive effects of CCTs that I would like to know what happened with the UCT. But baseline schoolgirls, we have that interesting experiment, and this is really the main part of the population, right? So if you show up at these villages, 8 out of 10 girls, more than 8 out of 10 girls will be in this strata, and then less than 2 in 10 will be in this strata, right? The average transfer size was about approximately $10 a month, which is equivalent to roughly 10% of mean household consumption. This is actually quite kind of in line with a lot of cash transfers values as a ratio of household consumption around the world. Places like Cambodia will have 2%, places like Nicaragua or Mexico will have 22%, but 10% is definitely generous enough. Okay, so kind of like the little recap. So remember the baseline schoolgirls, we have the CCT-UCT experiment, right? So there was this conundrum arose, so to speak. CCTs absolutely dominated per dollar in schooling outcomes. If you think of enrollment, if you're thinking attendance, if you're even thinking like test scores that we designed themselves and delivered at home, math, English, cognitive ability, CCT girls did much better than UCT girls in the experiment. So if people are asking you, what do you think, like should I condition, should I not condition, the answer is very difficult, but if you're just having kind of like blinders and thinking of schooling, there's not much doubt in my mind, like all the literature I've read, conditional cash transfers will do better per dollar, right? But that's not really the point, right? But UCT program had much larger effects, not just compared to the control group, compared to the CCT group, on reducing marriages, pregnancies, and even HIV after 2 years, right? And then, like I said, in baseline dropouts, we have this very large effects on kind of re-enrollment in the CCT group, and then that had knock-on effects on reducing pregnancies and marriages. Right? So the conundrum, we had our paper kind of like back and forth with the journal like 2-3 times. In the end, the editor wrote to us, said, look, if you can't explain to me what's happening here, you will not get published. Right? So like, you're telling me that there's a group of girls who went to school more, right? And I know from kind of like correlational evidence that like schooling and marriage are mutually exclusive. Therefore, there has to be a knock-on effect on marriages and pregnancies. And then you're telling me that this other group only got money and didn't improve their schooling at all, is doing much better on delaying marriages and pregnancies than the CCT group. So explain to us, and then if it's satisfactory, you can come in, otherwise not, right? So I literally spent, like we all did, the 3 of us, about like a month and a half. Like I'd be at the bus stop thinking about it, I'd be dreaming about it. But then we figured it out, and then, as most things in science, once you figure it out, it looks so obvious. But they kind of couldn't figure it out. So this is a bit of a kind of complex table, but these are endogenous follow-up statuses of schooling right after the program ended, right? And then these are my the 3 treatment arms in the study, right? You can see, and then these are marriage rates in the cells. And then these parentheses are row percentages of people across each row, like how much of them are in there. So first thing to notice, if you're enrolled in school, you're not married. Right? And it doesn't matter if you're in the control or treatment, whatever. So if people are staying in school, I'm not going to have any effect, right? So now think about how is CCT going to kind of compete with the UCT. CCT will only get its effect from these marginal effects on keeping 9 extra percentage of people and whatever its knock-on effect is on schooling, which seems to be about 1 in 2. So these girls, out of every 2 girls who dropped out of school, one of them was already married by the time we came back 1 month after the cash transfer stuff, right? So whatever that is, that 8%, 9% times 50% is going to produce this 4 percentage point improvement. Right? I can actually use technology here, right? But you see, what's happening with conditional girls, when they drop out of school, they look just like the control group. Right? Why? Because they're not getting any money. Right? Turns out, in this environment, having a few dollars in your pocket really keeps the guys away. Like, it's 50% versus 25%. That's a huge difference. But now, so what's the margin? Here, I'm affecting 9% of the 9 out of every 100 girls having a knock-on effect through schooling. Here, I have 40% of the girls who also dropped out of school, but they're all still getting money. And that times 25% is 10 percentage points. So why is 10 bigger than 4? Is because this group is way bigger than this group. Right? I have to have huge effects on schooling to kind of match the income effect. Right? So that's the trade-off. So if people ask you, oh, should I do conditional, should I do unconditional? Now you have to think twice. Which one do I care more about? Do I care more about schooling? Do I care all the other things for which money is really good for? Right? And it's not just this. There's delayed pregnancies, there's HIV, there's mental health. It's like whole loads of things that can show you these girls are doing better than these girls. Right? So now it becomes a little more complicated. Right? Despite the fact that I don't have a lot of time, I'm going to mention here, I have had people say, that looks very special case. Right? And I assure you that it's not. Like, this kind of numbers are very similar, actually, if you look at 15-year-old kids in Mexico. Those numbers are almost identical, right? So I'm not saying the income effect on sexual behavior is identical. Those might be very different. But the relative sizes of these groups, Progressa that we think is like this magical, very effective program, it really improved, schooling like 6, 7, 8 percentage points for those. Still in Progressa, 30% of the people are dropping out of school, even though the government's saying, pretty please go to school. Right? And then, I don't know if Mexico is denying those households the money or not, because the program is conditional. Maybe they don't monitor, maybe they don't care. But if they do, you're going to get the same kind of trade-off, where by denying the money to poor people who might need it for other things than just improving schooling, you're going to have this kind of perverse effect. So people had said this thing for a long time. People said, look, these social safety net programs, it doesn't make sense to deny them to poor people because they don't abide by the government's condition. But nobody had put kind of like a face on the problem. This is kind of like we feel this is the face. This now like hits people and they're like, it's actually real. These people aren't imaginary theoretical group. Like some. Right? Okay, so now the long-term effects. Like I said, in our pre-analysis plan, if you go to it in the AEA Social Science Registry, we have all these outcomes that we pre-specified. So now we're going to look at most of them here. Right, so now, reminding you, this is 2 years after those results that I showed you, and these people haven't gotten anything from us or anybody else in the meantime. Just getting older, moving on with their lives. So because the experiment before was, the UCT-CCT experiment was just in this group, we weren't talking about this group, but now we can talk about this group. In round 2, like 1 year into the program, they just gained about like 0.6 years more of education, and then they just kept that throughout, right? And the reason for that is that there's really no gradient in the control group over time. Like these are people who had dropped out of school. Mostly they're not going back to school. At the end of the, in Malawi, after 8 years, you sit an exam to get your primary school leading certificate. These people have 7 years of education compared to 7.6. And then the percentage who actually completed primary school is 37 versus 45%. It's really a large improvement, right? Here in this group, like all those things that I had from earlier, kind of like little higher enrollment, little like 0.2 standard deviation improvement in test scores and things like that, they're just kind of like mostly not there, Mainly because what's happening is that if you look here, 88% of these girls now, in the control group without any intervention, finished primary school by themselves. right? So 9 out of 10 girls, I'm giving money for something that they would have been doing anyway, right? So it really shows you the importance of kind of targeting these programs for cost effectiveness, but it's also really difficult to target this group ex ante because we can't target people who dropped out of school, right? We need to have some prediction of like who is going to drop out of school and then target them. Right? On top of that, most programs actually are school-based, so they go to schools and then they get their entire frame from the school. You miss this entire group altogether. Right? So targeting them means actually you have to have some information about them first. So it's not easy. Because we just didn't think that these people would be going and getting jobs like our data entry jobs and things like that are very rare in Zomba. We said, okay, well, what kinds of things will they do? They'll do agriculture. They might sell tomatoes on the side of the road. They might need to read a bus schedule and to figure out where to go, what to do. So we designed essentially a kind of a skills test on our own. You introduced me to somebody who's working with Young Lives. I had somebody come up to me at a conference saying, can we use this because we're just trying to think now. Our kids are also now this age, and when we look around, there's nothing that says, well, because we can't just look at labor market outcomes because it's just gobbledygook. So we just want to have something that indicates some sort of accumulation of skills. So what we have, this is an example, we're asking them to apply fertilizer to a plant, right? They're supposed to listen to instructions just once, and then they're supposed to just take the correct spoonfuls and then put them 5 centimeters on each side of the plant. Right? There are other things where they're either reading themselves or we're reading to them some transactions on the side of the road, like I bought 2 eggs and 3 tomatoes and I gave you this much, you're supposed to give me back correct change. Like that. Can they text message? Can they use a calculator? Can they calculate profits on a very simple kind of I can sell my wares here, or I can pay some transport costs to go to the city and then sell them there where the price is higher. Which one should I do? This very simple stuff. But these we thought were kind of more relevant than saying, okay, what's your daily wage and things like that. And we piloted these very carefully. They're highly correlated with the test scores that we showed improvements on 2 years ago. So if you did well on those tests, you can get at least some of these questions. If you didn't do well, I've seen people just shut down completely on this test, not even do the first one. That's very easy, right? Unfortunately, nothing on these things 2 years later. The only thing is they can text better. Right? And we know that this to be true because the unconditional schoolgirls did spend a lot of money on mobile airtime and things like that during the program. So they can text better, and then they're a little more familiar with the calculator, which is on a phone, it's on a smartphone. But you see, they can't really calculate profits better than anybody else. Even this group, where we saw huge improvements in finishing primary school. I mean, these people sat as finishing exams. That's important in Malawi, but they can't. It's just very depressing. So now, going on to marriage and fertility, you see now, so this is kind of the story that I was telling about with that 3x3 table that I showed you earlier, is that if you have such huge improvements in schooling, that's going to have knock-on effects on marriage and fertility just because they're mutually exclusive, right? So these girls opened up a kind of a 14 percentage point improvement over 29 in round 2. So 29%. Remember, we started with a completely not unmarried sample, never married sample, right? So by 1 year, 29% of the control group had gotten married compared to 15. Then it's 2 years later, it's 58 to 41. And then at the end, 4 years later, it's 80 to 70, right? These are very big. And then same thing with age at first marriage, ever pregnant. And actually, interestingly enough, total number of births is down by 0.15, which is roughly 10%. And if you notice, it's almost identical to their desired fertility decline as well. So we think they've already kind of reached. So they can have the same number roughly, or the same rate of births from here on. If they do, they'll still have lower number of babies. And then, places like Zambia and Malawi are pre-demographic dividend countries. So, this kind of thing could actually be important. But this is a small group. Over here, this is the part that really kind of knocked us out. So beginning, these girls were slowly kind of getting there. You can see kind of like 5% got married in the baseline schoolgirls. That was down to almost 1% in the UCT arm. And then 18 to 10, really big improvements immediately at the end of the program. Look here, it's gone down to 0 2 years later. Right? So now about 45% are married equally everywhere. In fact, the trend is kind of the opposite among the CCT group. Like when they were dropping out of school and not getting any money, they were kind of looking like the control group. But now with the slight increases in education, etc., they seem to be trekking in the opposite direction. Right? So, and then it's kind of looking at it, here the pregnancy is the same. If I don't have the total number of births here, they've caught up there as well. And there's absolutely no indication that they would like to have less number of babies. Okay, so we did like anemia in round 4. Unfortunately, we don't have it in rounds 2 and 3. Not much going on there. We have the GHQ-12 on their mental health. UCT girls were doing so much better than C. But both groups were kind of like less likely to be suffering potentially from, low-grade anxiety and depression. But UCT girls were much better off than the CCT girls here. They completely disappeared as soon as the money stopped. And I've just seen a paper like 2 weeks ago from Give Directly, like identical results. When people are getting money, they're very happy. Soon afterwards, they just revert back to their square one happiness. Number of meals eaten. This is number of meals with proteins eaten. So it's like meat, chicken, eggs, dairy, things like that. Like roughly half a meal per week more during the program. Afterwards, nothing. So they didn't really accumulate much to sustain those gains. Right? So this is HIV. As you'll see, just like the pregnancy and the marriage results, these have become completely kind of like congruent with those. UCTs were doing better, 4.2% clearance of HIV versus 2.1, significant at the 90% level, whereas there was nothing going on with the CCT. 2 years later, complete catch-up. Right? You can see the incidence here is roughly 1 percentage point per year, right? And it's almost double in the UCT group between the end of the program and the end line, right? 2 versus 3.5%. So in the end, kind of like everybody has roughly 6% in this group and about 15.6% in the baseline dropout. Right? So, like I said, nothing on employment, so I can fast forward there quickly. And this is empowerment. So for empowerment, you really need to go into our surveys and look at all the things that's in these indices, because otherwise we have like tables with 100 variables in them. But this one essentially what it's doing is it has things like self-efficacy, Rosenberg's self-efficacy in there. There's a social and political participation index. There's kind of, what else? There's your aspirations for your children. Like what do you want for them in terms of their like age at which they get pregnant, or like what level of schooling they should get to, girls versus boys, etc. And then kind of like subjective well-being, like on a ladder of 1 to 10, right? Not only we're not seeing any effects in the groups that we saw other improvements in, but actually the UCT girls are doing worse at N1. And if I look at the subcomponents of this thing, they're doing worse in all aspects. It's not coming just from one. And then it is mainly coming from the married girls, which is about 40-45% of the population, right? For them, it's like 0.3 standard deviations decline. Versus the unmarried ones, it's roughly the same, right? And you can see that here, actually, we have a super index of married empowerment, within which we're asking a lot of things relative to your husband, who controls the finances in the household, who, like, can you leave the house without worrying, abuse, and all these kinds of things. And it's not very good. So this is kind of consistent with the idea that waiting in the marriage market without accumulating some compensating human capital may not be the best idea. Other than the fact that, I have to weigh them against like increased welfare for 2 years. These girls were extremely happy for 2 years. They led really much nicer lives than their, counterfactual lives. Kind of, one of my colleagues thinks that this is kind of despite the fact that they were very, very well informed about when the program will end and it will not come back, etc., they kind of never thought about the end of it, and then the end might have hit them a little bit by surprise. kind of like all your cohort is getting married and moving on with life, and you're not doing all of those things, and then all of a sudden it's really, no, the money really stopped, oh, now what do we do? So that's certainly a possibility, which maybe reduces our external validity a little bit, because you can imagine maybe government programs don't work exactly well. Right? So I think in summary, the main thing that I take away is that these UCT effects, so a lot of people, because I'm at the bank, I get a lot of kind of like, oh, you say CCTs are good because you're the World Bank and you guys like CCTs, like that. I get this kind of stuff a lot. So like I've actually kind of like developed my kind of like talking points over the years. Now actually what I sincerely think is that what this shows me is that money is really great. Even very small amounts of money, but while you're getting it, right? So it's really, I mean, we've everything lit up for the UCT girls, like mental health, nutrition, HIV, you know, I can show you graphs of like the age of their sexual partners. None of them are with guys over 25, whereas like a quarter of the girls in the control group are, right? And that's where the HIV effects and etc. are coming from. So it's really good. As a safety net, they're great. But I don't really think this type of like small monthly cash transfers done for a short period or done even maybe for a kind of slightly longer period during secondary school or something like that are likely to have any transformative effects over the long run in these kinds of settings. Right? So that's kind of my way of hedging. You know, like if you think of one goal, they're great. If you think of another goal, they're really not good at all. Right? And the CCTs, there's this really small and kind of disadvantaged subgroup on whom you can show like very, very large effects. But even for them, you know, we're not seeing improvements outside of kind of like the demographics and then the kind of assortative matching with more educated husbands. Right? Well, like I said, the limitation here is that I'd really like to know in that group what would a UCT have done. Like looking at the baseline schoolgirls, I'm not very hopeful, but as a kind of, let's say, if you called me a randomista, as a randomista, I would have to say, I don't know, right? Like, I just don't know. This is what the evidence is, and we didn't do that study. So let me finish quickly with the children and the husbands. I have 10 minutes. Okay, I think I can at least fit in the highlights. So let's remember for a second, like before I go into kind of like weird non-experimental data, right? Because the children are now selected. They're not, you know, I'm not having an experiment on pre-existing children. Like a bunch of children are born, but we affected who was born. So it's going to be difficult to look at effects. But if you think about it, the baseline dropouts, they have kind of like large sustained decreases in fertility. They have decreases in desired lifetime fertility. So I have actually a permanent change in the composition of mothers. Right? They're like, I now have a group of mothers that are actually going to be more educated and slightly older and things like that, right? So that's going to have effects. The baseline schoolgirls, they had very temporary decreases in fertility. They've since caught up. And because their lifetime desired fertility is indifferent, I don't really expect anything will change in the future. So I kind of now have these differences in the age composition of children, because they had children later, they have younger children. Right? And then there is actually a temporary change in the composition of mothers. So to the extent that certain types of mothers were likely to have babies earlier rather than delay for later, I have this kind of thing. So this is that histogram that I was talking to you about. So this is the program interval. We call this the utero because this is 9 months from the cash transfers ending. So like if you're a baby that's born here, you would have been exposed to the program in utero, like whichever month you're born in. And actually, there are very few births here. Most of them are happening, as you can see here, in this period. So you'll be exposed like in the 3rd trimester for like some $5, $10 a month your mother is getting, and whatever benefits from that, you might benefit, right? But these kids, if you're born here, you're fully exposed to it for 2 years. Your mom's getting money when you're 0 to 2, right? If you're born here, like some of it is in utero, and then another year and a half, etc. You get the point. And then here, you're not exposed at all, right? So that'll come in like relevant later. But the thing that I want you to note is that, so they were going like this, not having a lot of babies, and then about like 3-4 months later, the first little spike happens. But that just catches them to the counterfactual group. Like, so this is the UCT group. So that would still not catch them up. That just means that whatever they've accumulated, these declines here, they keep them. It's just they're now going to be going with them like this. But no, about like 9 to 12 months later, there's this huge bump again. All these babies are being born here. And that's the catch-up. Right? And then now we've thrown them out of sync. When my control group is having babies, they're not, because it's just biologically. It's just going like that. Right? So that happened. Right? So I should probably skip the lit review here, but mainly, all of these papers, they're essentially their main point, including Leah's work from Mexico, is that if you're exposed during those ages to cash transfers, you will likely benefit. And the earlier you're exposed, the more you'll benefit, and the more money your mom is getting, the more you'll benefit. So the things seem maybe not linear, but there's definitely a gradient, right? Whereas in our study with cash transfer amounts on the mother's outcomes, we mostly don't see any gradients at all. Like the minimum amounts that we give do all the work, and then additional money doesn't really improve much, right? But here, the evidence isn't like that. So there is definitely reason to think, but then where do I expect to see that? Again, if you think back to that 3 by 3, I'm not expecting to see that in the conditional cash transfer group, because whenever a kid is being born, the mother is no longer getting any money, because this is a schooling CCT for the mother, right? So I don't really expect these kids to benefit from the cash, so it's really going to be in the UCT arm. Somehow you were getting UCTs and you decided, oh, I already found the love of my life, I'm going to get married, I'm going to have a baby. Those are going to be the kids who potentially benefit, right? So and then, like I said, we divide into those 3 epochs that seem reasonable. This is not a pre-analysis plan, this is just something afterwards we kind of concocted. So this is the height for age z-scores for kids by birth month during this period. So this is raw, right? So this is not an experimental estimate, because I have all sorts of, like the kids who are born here to the UCT group may look completely different than the control group mothers that I'm subtracting off, right? So, but what I want to do is, like, I want to think of, so that effect, if I kind of summarize them here, it's almost like 0.8 standard deviations higher, like, but the confidence interval is quite large. Nothing here, and then it actually kind of looks negative afterwards, right? So, if you think about it a little bit, like, what is this really telling me? It's not a policy question that I'm particularly interested in. It's almost like, think about an RCT where there was differential attrition in the RCT, and then you were just saying, what are the effects in the group that remained in the study that I'm looking at, ignoring all the biases that come from the differential attrition, right? I might be interested, if these people all had finished their fertility, then I might be interested in looking at all the stock of kids and then how do they look between groups. But because it's not at all finished, right? I'm really worried that what I'm looking at here doesn't really answer this question. Do cash transfers confer a protective effect on children in a program where I'm treating prospective mothers, right? Well before they even, conceive, so to speak, right? So then, obviously you're going to have all these kind of like confounding factors in here. There's going to be the child's age, which is going to be a factor. There's going to be maternal age. There's going to be temporary mother selection, there's going to be permanent mother selection, and then I even have differences in potentially the quality of the husbands and whatever comes from that, whether it's through his income or through his genes, etc. All those going to have then effects on the child. Only after that, I will then actually have direct effects of cash transfers on the child, which may be through the mother's nutrition, mother's maternal stress, parental practices to the extent that they learn in school, like what to do with kids, etc. Right? And that's the kind of thing I'm interested in. So we're just going to quickly try to get at that. So we think of this kind of like child age as really a trivial thing, because if you think about it, let me go to, I have a, sorry, because I'm going to quickly, I should have hit my, my hyperlink here, but, so this is actually just the trend by age. In Malawi, and most other places, I've seen this in Nicaragua as well, when kids are born, they're actually not that worse off than American kids that are being born. But then by like 18 months to a year, they've already hit like -1.5, right? So just because I'm going to be looking at younger kids in UCT and older kids in control, I'm just going to be biasing the results towards UCT, right? So I want to get rid of those kinds of trivial things, and then only leave in there kind of mechanisms that are actually meaningful rather than trivial, right? So, and what are the non-trivial ones? Things like maternal age, things like permanent mother selection, and then father selection. So essentially what I can do is I can do a mediation analysis a la Baron Kenny 86, and then just kind of control for all of these things and see what remains, right? And essentially when we do that, kids born during the program, this thing barely budges down to like 0.8 standard deviations in the end of like height for HZ score. The only difference really comes from when we add a battery of mother's baseline characteristics. So what's essentially happening is there is a kind of like a better type of mother that's having births earlier on. When we control for that, like we knock down this effect a little bit, but we really can't get rid of it. And then everything else that's happening here is actually happening from this crazy thing around this threshold. Is that if you look here, right, kids who are just born here in this period, they're the youngest for their group. So when I control for their age, I knock down the bias, right? The ones that are born right here during this baby boom, they're the oldest kids in this period. So then actually when I control for that, I actually make them look slightly better. So essentially, I go back down here, what happens is, oh yeah, there we go. It's kind of like that. So actually within the 9 months afterwards, there almost seems like there's maybe a negative effect of like maybe the shock of like the cessation of the program, etc. And then absolutely nothing afterwards. But the kids who are born here, as much as we can tell, controlling for all the selection in like the various things that I listed, it still looks like there's an effect. And actually that makes total sense to me because when I talk to my colleagues who know this literature well, like Leah or Emanuele Galasso, they say, look, you've shown us already that the mother was eating more proteins, etc. during this period. You've shown me that her psychological well-being was much better, and maternal stress is a big determinant of both birth weight and like potentially height, right? So there are channels there, they're definitely there, and then you've shown them already, so this is not crazy. Maybe the size of this thing is really big, but then again, you look at the standard there, the 95% confidence interval includes like a 0.1, 0.2 standard deviation. So let me just finish by husbands, because you all laughed at the husbands, like you'd be sad not to show them. So these are the marriage, the same picture, but now instead of babies being born, this is like the month that they report getting married. You see that it's just slightly shifted a few months earlier, so literally looks like shotgun marriages. It really looks like that, right? I mean, I want to actually analyze this more and just write a separate paper just on this, because one of the literatures that bugs me the most is this chicken egg thing about does early marriage cause school dropout or does school dropout cause early marriage, and then everybody will, and there's not a lot of very good studies on it, but if I look here, it really does look like these girls are like when they're 5-6 months pregnant, they're like, let my father find that guy, if we're lucky. So this is kind of like what we pre-registered to look at in the husbands. And we suffer a little bit from, there are a few husbands who really didn't want to be interviewed and they chased us away and things like that. But we have decent data on husbands. And essentially what we see is that I told you before, among the baseline dropouts who had these massive education gains, they get much more educated husbands, right? Control group mean looks like only 10% of the husbands in the control group have a secondary school certificate. It's up to 17.5% in the treatment group, so that's quite large. But really, the husband quality index, which is the index of all of these things standardized, it's really not much. And the highest grade completed is there. This is about a 1.64 T-stat. But overall, if I look at it, not much going on. They're not more likely to be employed. They're not like higher cognitive ability. They're not like psychologically better off, anything like that. Conditional girls in the baseline schoolgirl group, exactly the same. But then in the unconditional one, all of these things are essentially negative. And then if I look at the Raven score, this is not self-reported anything, like these people are doing colored matrices test. And this is almost like a 0.4 standard deviation low. It could be by chance, but it's consistent with all the other things that I saw that are actually experimentally valid estimates of like empowerment and marriage quality, etc. It looks like they're suffering in the marriage market as a result of having waited. And because there's no dowries, they can't pay for better husbands, so they have to settle for. So let me just kind of, so let me just answer this question, kind of what lasts? So the effects of unconditional cash transfers in this setting, really transient. Like I said, as safety nets, they're great, but every one of the strong effects we saw disappeared within 2 years. Waiting to get pregnant and married seems like it should be a good thing, but they may have actually lost out in the marriage market, with the potential exception that actually potentially permanent benefits on children from transitory income shocks, like at the right moment. So this actually gives us something to think about, like adolescent policies for cash transfers targeted to adolescent girls, right? When, how long, under what conditions, like I was talking to some CDC folks who work in the US with like foster kids and etc. They were saying, we think actually 18 is too early to kick people out of the system. We think now it should be 24 or something like that. So definitely in these places where the average height for age Z-score is almost -2, it makes sense to think about these kinds of things. And then I think the effects of schooling can be durable, but you really need kind of like good targeting to get the cost-effective intervention among that group. You don't want to give it to kind of everybody. And then I think this is the last point I'll make, is that we have these safety net programs that might be penalizing the adolescent girls exactly at the wrong moment. Right? Like you saw the consequences in that 3x3 book. So maybe one thing that we can think about is kind of like the earned income tax in the United States. It doesn't make sense for these programs to have a marginal tax rate which is 100%. Like you cross the threshold and then all of a sudden you're not eligible at all. So a much better program might be everybody has a universal small grant, and then you incentivize things on top of it, so that even though when they don't do what you want them to do, they're still getting something basic, and that might keep still a lot of the bad things from happening. So let me stop there. I'm sure I'm over time, but I apologize.
Well, thank you. I heard you present here. You came to Berkeley a couple years ago, right?
We come all the time.
You come all the time. Well, so I heard your last big one over on the other side of campus, and obviously read your papers. So anyway, so this is a much smaller endeavor to do a program inspired by some of the conditional cash transfer programs that have been done with adolescents in other places, here in San Francisco or across the bay in San Francisco. And the work builds on a body of work that we have been, a series of multidisciplinary kinds of studies that we've been doing with adolescents in the Mission District for over a decade. And I'll present a little bit of the work, a couple slides on what we had learned through this work that brought us to the place of wanting to pursue a conditional cash transfer approach. So in a prospective cohort study that we did with adolescents recruited from a whole range of venues in San Francisco's Mission District, what really stood out was the need to focus on the social and structural environment in which people are meeting partners. This is a sexual reproductive health focused study. And gang affiliation played a very strong role in people's social networks. You can see that about 40% of youth reported that they had close friends who were in gangs, and about 20% of the females in the study reported that their partner was in a gang. And so the role of gang affiliation and sort of the way in which gangs structure people's partnerships and social networks was really influential in pregnancy, in terms of our pregnancy incidents. That was, no matter sort of how we constructed our models, gang affiliation kept showing up as an important predictor of pregnancy incidents among the young women in the study. And then we did a number of qualitative studies to try to understand a little bit more about this and to also think about what some of the next steps could be. So in some of the qualitative work for males, it was really clear how street gangs shaped partnership patterns that then created a situation of elevated risk for pregnancy and for sexually transmitted infections. Some of the main reasons being one, limited time for relationships because of obligations to the gang first and foremost. A disinterest in commitment, the commitment of a relationship to avoid the emotional vulnerability that, given that they've already had quite a few demands that were sort of emotional in terms of being involved with street life. And then multiple partners bringing status, as illustrated in this book here. We've got our reputation. So all of this then positioned relationships so that it was often the case that even though nearly everyone in our study said that they didn't want to become pregnant, the young girls, and that the guys didn't want to become a father, there was a lot of pregnancy that occurred, and that it was often adopted as a strategy, or unprotected sex was adopted as a strategy to strengthen relationship commitment and to draw partners away from the street. I just wanted to make a quick note, too, that while I'm focused mostly on the reproductive health outcomes, that there's also the violence exposure itself that presents pretty substantial health consequences, mental health consequences for young people. I mean, thinking about, how could we intervene on this, what really stood out in so many of our quantitative studies and also the more small, tailored, qualitative work that we were doing was how many young people articulated a desire to have a better future, to go to college, to finish high school, not to be living a life that they're leading, but that there were a number of constraints in being able to achieve those goals. And so the intervention Puedo that we designed tried to address some of these. And you can see in the first quote, a young woman commented that young people in the mission can't go to college because they don't have the money, they're undocumented, maybe their family doesn't support them, they don't see a future. If you're undocumented, why would you go to college? And then this comment by a young person who was familiar with the gang culture of the mission and not involved himself, talking about how he really wished that young people could go to college, but there's much more immediate demands and that make that kind of future planning very difficult for people. And they don't have support at their home or at school to achieve those goals. So Yo Puedo is an intervention that we designed that had two pieces, a conditional cash transfer component coupled with a life skills intervention designed to support the achievement of goals, with the goal to promote sexual health. The conditional cash transfers were tied to education, job training, and reproductive health wellness. And we thought a lot about what the intervention features should be in this kind of setting, because we couldn't offer the safety net in terms of something so substantial to offset costs. And so the thinking was really more that the conditional cash transfers here would be a sort of a nudge, destigmatizing behaviors that may not be very cool or that people might not elect to achieve in their social environment, but that might sort of make more prominent a strategy for achieving some goals. We wanted to focus, given our interest in working with youth and within the context of their social networks and how influential peers are for young people, so we designed it to have a social network base. The education literature in particular talks quite a bit about the importance of goal setting. And so the very beginning of the activity is actually that the youth set their own goals, and we had these sort of pathways of goals that they could choose and sort of place themselves there. So whether they were on an education track, or for those who already dropped out, looking at job training kinds of activities. We had both participation and performance-based incentives, so going to tutoring programs, showing up for a life skills session, there was a small payment made there, but then also, sort of how well people did. Were you able to pass a high school exit exam that was required and had been failed previously? And the incentives were paid to youth directly. This was a 6-month intervention period, very short, very transient perhaps. We didn't follow past that period because we were just at sort of a design and feasibility step here. And the life skills groups were really tailored for the first 2 months. The questions that shaped this investigation were a number of feasibility-related questions and acceptability. How would it work to recruit social networks into a study and then randomize groups of people when you've got this sort of complexity of, we were using a fixed size and people's friends may, their friendship groups might have ended up getting randomized or looser ties to a control when they're in the intervention. Could we actually get youth to participate? And then there were a lot of questions in the community about, are you actually giving cash to youth? We were paying up to $200 for the 6 months. And what would people do with the money? Would they become targets because they were known to be participants? And then we were also really interested in the second piece, which is, can we see any evidence that this might actually move some of the outcomes or things on the pathway to the outcomes of interest. So we focused with both males and females, Latino youth, and members of their social network. They didn't have to, their friends didn't need to be Latino, but we started with Latino youth and recruited in places where that was a predominant population. We were focused on both in and out of school, in part to try to see if we could identify a group where this sort of an intervention approach would be have the most traction. We did some work related to intervention design using strategies from behavioral economics with this willingness to accept approach, which I won't take the time to present here, but to try to figure out what should we incentivize. We don't want to incentivize things that people are going to do anyway, and also to try to figure out, well, what amounts are meaningful. So we wanted to sort of get away with the lowest amount possible, but an amount that would have have the desired effect of nudging people. So we did focus groups. We did sort of a mixed methods thing to try to draw on data from different sources to answer some of those questions. And then conducted the feasibility study with participants randomized to the intervention arm or just an observational control group. So just sort of conceptually, we had these CCT goals that people set at the outset and then could accomplish over the 6 months and be reimbursed monthly for those for which they had provided evidence of completion. And then we had the life skills sessions. Some of these short-term outcomes are more the self-efficacy and empowerment and decision-making capacity and that sort of thing, and the composition of their social group. And then the intermediate outcomes, which are the ones that we analyzed, are both focused on social environments and individual risk behaviors. One of the themes of the life skills was advocacy, and so here's an illustration of the way in which this played out. That it started in a way of sort of engaging people and thinking about how can you advocate certain ideas within your group of friends, and that theme was followed throughout in terms of how do you advocate when you go to a clinic and within your school if you're not getting your needs met, kind of going to counselors and sort of learning to kind of take some personal responsibility and also move the peer group to support each other in advocating for the goals. Here's a map of the neighborhood, and you can see that gang lines are pretty prominent and fixed, and a lot of there are a lot of other resources. And we had a number of community partners, which is one of the main messages here. High schools, community agencies, and we recruited through those relationships. This is essentially a quick glimpse at who we ended up with. This is a very similar population to the other studies that we've done in the mission. As you can see, about 85% were Latino, the majority of the rest are African American, and about a third foreign born, which is also typical in the neighborhood. In terms of the social networks question, one of the issues in recruiting social networks is you always sort of wonder, well, who are people going to invite with them? Because we recruited individuals and then they could enroll with their close friends. And so we were curious to know who do people choose to join with them. And we found that they chose people quite a bit like they were, which was actually good because we had targeted recruitment. So I think that gave us some confidence and information about how to achieve the heterogeneity that we wanted. Here we didn't do as well as I might have liked. If you talk to people who run programs, they can't believe how much participation we had. If you talk to people who want to try to get funding to carry forward a program, they want 85 or 90% participation and adherence. It takes time. A lot of the youth, for them, a goal, the goals we had were much more complex. They wanted to get an ID, so when they were stopped by the police, they had something to at least show who they were. So this is an area that requires a little more attention from us. We did see some promising things moving in the right direction. The first column here are some results showing the social environment influences, and then also below that the individual behaviors. And we see that at least the odds ratios are below 1, suggesting that the intervention group, Cueto compared to a control group, that, for example, spent less time hanging out on the street, which is a proxy for spending time in a higher risk environment. And a little bit of movement here, and per protocol, I won't take the time to go through what that is. We just sort of had a baseline of what would we want to see in terms of a baseline level of exposure to the intervention. And for those who had this higher level of exposure, the effects are a bit stronger. So we, certainly through this work wanted to suggest some modifications to the design, one of which is to really work on developing workshops as opposed to the life skills group, because people came and they were enthused, but it's hard to sustain that level of involvement. And so that's one area. We also have proposed to do more leveraging of the social network influence through not only incentivizing individual achievement, but incentivizing the achievement when everyone in your group does activity X or Y. So there's a lot of interest from the community partners, and I think people felt excited that we were able to do this in some varied settings, both in schools and also in community settings, and engage both in and out of school youth. Some of the youth, for some people, it was exciting for them. In fact, we just ran into some participants last week who said, I've been finishing at City College and transferring, and it was because of Yo Puedo. Anyway, those are anecdotes, but at least puts a smile on your face. And we did the sort of in-depth interviews with some people afterwards to debrief us. And I like this comment. We keep each other from getting locked up and knocked up. And these were 3 girls who joined together in Yo Puedo, and they felt like having that social support while they were there, and that it was nurtured through the intervention. So anyway, I'd love to carry the study forward. I'm busy doing other studies right now, but would be interested in looking at a way to continue doing this kind of work. I just want to acknowledge all of our collaborators. We have several people on the faculty here at Berkeley who were involved as co-investigators on this study. Thank you.
So I'm Ahna Suleiman, and I am talking today, and Ron Dahl is sitting here, and he's going to be chiming in as appropriate. And the good news is hopefully we'll get the slides going, because I have a couple of nice pretty pictures, but I actually don't have any data to show you today. And the reason that I don't is I'm actually going to be talking about a project that we have just received preliminary notification that we are going to be awarded, and the official announcement will be made next week. So we're really excited to share it with you. And I'm here talking on behalf of the Center on Developing Adolescent that we are launching here, or that we have launched here at Berkeley. So Ron and I are working in partnership with Linda Welbrecht here at Berkeley, and then we also have leadership at other places across the country. And this is a really exciting group of people that are coming together to really figure out how we can use developmental science to inform how we're thinking about programs and policies for young people. And so you'll see that my title of the talk today, I said, was a case study on motivation and learning. And the reason that I selected that as a case study on motivation and learning is that when we're talking about conditional cash transfers or something like CCTs, we're really thinking about what are the ways in which we can get people to do whatever it is that we want them to do? What are the ways that we can wick their motivation, that we can engage them in doing something that may not necessarily be a priority for them, may not be a desirable behavior for them, but what are the things that we can really use as levers? And the other thing is that I really want to clarify what we're talking about when we're using the word adolescence. And so we've had a couple of examples here where we've really focused on teenagers. And I think that I've been thinking more and more, we always say that for us, adolescence really starts at the physical transition into puberty, and it ends when you start taking away all the scaffolding that you had as an adolescent and you're transitioning into adult-like roles. But I think that ultimately, I'm thinking about it very simply as like it's the tweens, the teens, and the young adults that are all part of this group that we're thinking about as adolescents. It's not just any one part of them. And the interesting thing is, what can developmental science, thank you, in what ways can developmental science really help reframe for us what might work when? And what might be the most appropriate levers? What might be the ways that we want to think about what is the science telling us about what's motivating adolescents' behaviors, what's important to them, and then what are they going to do as outcomes? And the interesting thing is, if you think about both the last two talks and then also what I'm talking about today, often we are trying to change adolescents' sexual and reproductive health behavior. It's a really normative part of adolescence. You know, the transition into puberty is something that people are thinking about sex more, they are biologically driven to be interested in reproduction, they become physically capable, and suddenly we're saying, oh, wait a minute, we're going to try to figure out what it is that we can insert in there so that you don't do that right now. Or we're going to try to insert something in there so that we can figure out a way so that you're going to do it the way that it doesn't lead to pregnancy or an STI or HIV infection. And so what I'm going to do today is I'm going to be using this project that we are launching. And I'm going to be giving a big caveat. It's sort of a false sale up here. We don't have any CCDs explicitly written into this project. And
It's in your title.
I know it's in the title, but we're exploring it. It will be something that we could explore. So what I'm going to show to you is a really complex thing that's happening. And I'm going to describe to you why it's happening, because there has been a really huge resurgence in trying to figure out how do we get young women globally to delay their reproductive onset. I was having a wonderful talk with somebody about 4 years ago, and their comment to me, and no offense to anybody in the room, was that the World Bank has suddenly discovered teen pregnancy. And that suddenly it was something that they really wanted to dig into and figure out. And I think that it's something that's very interesting, especially for those of us who have been working in reproductive health for a long time. This isn't a new thing. So the project that I'm going to describe is, it's called Adolescent 360, and some of you may have heard about it. Basically what happened is that some funders, predominantly the Gates Foundation and the Children's Investment Fund Foundation, became very interested in trying to figure out how do we change the reproductive behavior of young women between the ages of 15 and 19 years old in sub-Saharan Africa. They were very alarmed by the fact that young women in this age group accounted for about 18% of pregnancies. They led to about 2.2 million births. That complications from pregnancy and childbearing were the leading cause of death for young women in this age group. They wanted to do something about it. And so what they decided, they put out an RFP that said, we've got a couple of criteria. We want to develop an anthropologically and developmentally informed model, and they actually used the word cognitive development, and we switched it to just be development so that it wasn't just about cognition, that uses user-centered design to come up with a solution that can be, by making this investment, they are hoping that they can develop a prototype that's really going to have a profound change on this behavior. Now this is a pretty big challenge. They selected 3 countries. They selected Ethiopia, Nigeria, and Tanzania. And they specifically did it because these countries have adolescent sexual and reproductive health policies in place that aren't making much of a difference on behavior. We aren't really seeing any marked decrease in any of the indicators that they were hoping to see changes on. And so the idea was, let's bring together this really dynamic, diverse team of people and see what we can do. And so Population Services International, PSI, became the lead agency that applied for this grant. They pulled together the partners, and they brought together all of us that you can see down here. Now, PSI pulled in SFH Nigeria because they specifically felt like they didn't have the expertise on the ground that they needed there. They brought in a technology partner, which is Triggerize, and Triggerize's primary mechanism has been to help create technology platforms that allow for clinics to communicate with patients and allow for reminders to go out. And we're really excited about the opportunity to think about what are developmental ways that we can use technology to motivate behavior. And so we will be partnering with them. We have the Center on Developing Adolescents, which is us, and we are going to be helping to use a developmental lens. We are also going to be helping bridge the participatory component, so how can we use youth participation throughout this? IDEO.org was brought in as the design partner, and then Ogilvy and Mather Africa were brought in as the communications partners. So this is the process that we have boldly decided to undertake. The investment in this has been $30 million over the next 4 years. And in the first 3 months, we're basically going to be gathering a little bit more data. In this next phase, in the inspiration phase, we will be working closely, doing a very participatory process to try to engage these very diverse countries, which have very different contextual factors, both between the countries and within the countries, to determine what are these things, what are the levers that are going to be most effective. And if you think about this, especially from a cultural or anthropological perspective, we're having to untangle a lot of things that have been raised here. We're trying to untangle how do you separate maturity from things like marriage and childbearing? What do you do if you're encouraging young women to delay these things, but you have nothing to offer them instead? And that was a great point that Berk showed in his slides. If you delay childbearing but then don't offer anything else in its place, what does that mean for these young women? The other thing that we're going to be working on very heavily in this inspiration phase is we need to be keeping the developmental piece in mind. So what works for young women at different points in their development, and this may be pubertal development, it may be social and cultural development, there may be other factors that are going on, it may be their roles and responsibilities that they have in their families, all of those things are going to need to be integrated into these models. We're then going to be moving quickly into ideation, and the difference of this project compared to a lot of other projects is that the goal is going to be try fast, fail fast, and learn. And so they'll be developing prototypes of projects, trying them out. It may be at that point that we decide maybe we want to look at comparing things. Is cash encouraging women to use LARCs versus encouraging them to stay in school is going to have differential effects? If you offer cash when women are 15, is that different than offering cash to a family when a young woman is 11? Are there different things that are happening in there? But this is going to be the try fast, fail fast, learn fast phase. Then we'll be moving into a pilot phase. This is the first year and a half of the project. They will be piloting these projects in all of these 3 countries, and then the most successful pilots will then be taken to scale. And so the last 2.5 years of the project will really be focused on what things are most effective, and also what can be replicated. So what works in multiple countries, in multiple contexts that could also be used in other places across the world. So I put this slide in here just saying, like, we don't know. We don't know actually if CCTs or money fits in here at all. And our goal in this is very explicit. They do want to get about 330,000, I think that's the newest number that we have, young women to take up contraceptive. And this is young women between the ages of 15 and 19 years old. In 4 years, the goal is to get 330,000 young women to take up contraception. The other thing that we're going to be looking at is they also are trying to they're trying to ameliorate somewhere in the ballpark of 160,000 births. They're hoping that they will see a marked decrease in teen birth rates. And so the goals are really lofty. But I think that you all are raising some interesting things today that we can think about, like where might the money help? Where might it make sense? And I think that we're going to be really grappling with developmentally what is most important. You know, we have some interesting research that shows that for especially adolescents in the pubertal range, sometimes peer and social status is much more important than money. And so if we can leverage that, that may be something that's more sustainable because it might not ever go away, whereas the cash might. And we will be playing with these things as we embark on this project. Do you have anything else you want to add in the last minute?
I would just say 2 things briefly. I think one of the issues that has come up in the earlier presentations is we pick intuitively a period of time, a group of ages, or social transitions with school, and then we think, after we get the data, about the complexities of how we have affected the trajectory of these individual lives. And I think the goal with this very large, multi-team, multidisciplinary project is to really think strategically about the developmental trajectory in terms of biological development, social transitions, and think about leverage points. And to really think about the larger complex processes and where those leverage points are. And then I think, as Ahna has already said, then to think strategically about what kinds of interventions are going to be most impactful during those leverage points, including the fact that social motivation may be as or not more important than financial rewards or some complex interactions, and to embed experiments within this larger structure of these studies. And so we will be very much in a brainstorming and rapid learning phase, including wanting to get ideas and wisdom from people who have been out there struggling with very parallel parts of these problems, who have ideas about how they might leverage things more effectively in these studies. So we really will be welcoming input from many people, and we'll be trying out these ideas. Thanks.
Thanks, Ahna.
Good afternoon, everybody. So my name is Sandra McCoy. I'm in the Division of Epidemiology in the School of Public Health. And I am also presenting a data-free talk. Because this is a study that's ongoing. So I'm telling you a little bit about what we have going on, and we'll hopefully have results at the end of the year. But this focuses on the application of conditional cash transfers to the HIV treatment and care continuum. And I thought I would start here with a bit of a conceptual map about where my work is and where some of the other talks fit in terms of HIV. So if you think about this, this pathway from the acquisition of HIV infection to our goal, which is to have people with HIV on continuous lifelong treatment, the studies that target prevention behaviors are down here. So these are conditional and unconditional cash transfer programs that aim to increase school attendance, to change partner choice, to reduce risk behavior. So obviously Berk's study was really important in the HIV world when the results were presented. There have also been cash transfer studies that aim to improve uptake of HIV testing and linkage to care after diagnosis. And the space that I spend a lot of time in is in the treatment side. And we're hypothesizing that we could also apply cash transfers here, which is to use them to improve adherence and retention care, and also to relink treatment defaulters back to the clinic. So just by way of background, most of you probably know how effective antiretroviral treatment, or ART, is. But I think this graph shows it really well. This is the adult life expectancy in South Africa after public sector provision of ART in 2004. And that you can see in a very short period of 8 years, there was an 11-year gain in life expectancy. And this is thought to be one of the most dramatic increases in life expectancy in a general population in the history of public health. So ART is extremely effective for the individual. But in 2011, there was a landmark clinical trial that was conducted that showed that when people are on treatment and they're adherent to their medication and virally suppressed, that they're basically uninfectious and they cannot transmit to their partners. And so at that point, it became very clear that keeping people on treatment and adherent was very important, not only for the individual clinical benefit to themselves, but the public health or societal benefit to reducing onward transmission. But adherence is not as simple as you might think it is. Not only in HIV, but with other chronic diseases, it's very hard to get people to take medicine every day. And in low and middle income countries, it's been increasingly recognized that these economic factors are significant barriers to adherence and to retention and care. And one of these economic factors that I'm very interested in is food security. And this is when people have access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food to maintain a healthy and active life. And there's been a growing body of evidence that when people are food insecure, they're less likely to be adherent to their antiretroviral treatment. They're more likely to fall out of care, and they start treatment later than people who are food secure. And there are several potential mechanisms through which this happens. There's an economic mechanism that they have to make decisions about how to spend their time and their money, and that might not always tip the balance in the favor of going to a clinic. There are sort of issues in terms of side effects, taking medication without food. This is clearly an obstacle for many people. When you're on ART, you're actually recovering, you have an appetite that comes back, and if you don't have food around, that might be a disincentive to take your medication. And then also there's some mental health pathways. When you're food insecure, there's a lot of anxiety and stress in your life, and that can have negative impacts on service uptake. I'm going to skip that just for time. So despite this sort of growing body of evidence about this negative effect of food insecurity on HIV outcomes, there's actually a very limited body of evidence about intervention studies in this space. There's only a few studies that have actually tried to mitigate food insecurity in some way to improve HIV clinical outcomes. And of those studies, the approaches are really diverse in terms of what kind of assistance they're providing and also the type of individual that they're targeting. But despite this diversity, there are some positive effects on adherence. But the truth is that the lack of rigorous evaluations really limits anything we can say about this body of evidence. There's studies with no comparison groups, very small sample sizes. Often the size of the food basket is so large that it could not be sustainable in resource-limited settings. And so our team also wondered, could we use cash? Could cash potentially be as effective as food assistance for improving adherence to ART? And there's been this long-standing debate about cash versus food assistance, not in the HIV world, but in the sort of general population world. And there's only one study that has looked at this among an HIV-infected population, and they found no difference between a food basket and an equivalently valued cash transfer. And we know from other studies that cash is often cheaper to distribute, and it might actually be preferred over food assistance in some settings. Another reason to think about cash in this case is that donors are increasingly transitioning to cash and vouchers. Giving food baskets is kind of clunky, it's bulky, it's expensive, and there's a growing body of evidence that when you give people cash directly, that it actually does as well or better than other traditional forms of aid, particularly in anti-poverty settings. And actually, Berk said this, that the rapid scale-up of conditional and unconditional cash transfers all over the world has really changed the landscape of what we're able to do in the HIV world. 6 to 7 years ago, when we started thinking about this, the proposition of doing a cash transfer study was really unusual, and we were really on the margins of what was acceptable. And now everyone's thinking about cash transfers, policymakers know about them, beneficiaries know about them, so it's no big deal anymore. So our study is the AFIA study in Shinyanga, Tanzania, and our research question is whether food or cash assistance for people who have HIV infection can improve their adherence to antiretroviral therapy and retention and care. And we're testing 3 models. Our comparison group is just the standard of care, where all patients receive nutrition assessment and counseling. And we have 2 active treatment arms. In the first, patients receive nutrition assessment and counseling plus a monthly food basket. And the food basket and the cash transfer in this other arm are conditional on monthly visits with the HIV care provider. The cash transfer is about $10 US per month, and it's equivalently valued as the food basket. So it's the same amount of money that they take home, or the same value that they take home. And we are conducting our study among HIV treatment initiates. And here's one of the reasons why. This is the likelihood of employment before and after treatment initiation in South Africa. So at time 0 here is when people start treatment. And so what you see is that people with HIV infection gradually start falling out of the labor force because they're getting sicker and sicker with their HIV infection. And then at some point they're diagnosed and they get on treatment, and then they gradually return to labor force as they recover. And so what we're doing is providing a short-term assistance in the form of food or cash for a 6-month window right here. And our goal here is to prevent some of the descent into distress that we see in these households, where they sell off productive assets, where you lose a second adult in the household to be the caregiver for the HIV-infected adult. So our hypothesis is just a very short window of support here can prevent that sort of economic decline, but can also help them establish good habits right as they're starting treatment. And our basic study design is we're randomizing about 800 people into these 3 arms. We've completed enrollment, and we're actually just about to finish the 6-month outcomes for this cohort. And we're looking at adherence, retention, and a host of secondary outcomes at 6 and 12 months. So keep in mind the cash transfers and the food transfers are only for 6 months. So we'll know whether or not they work at the completion of the transfer period, but then we'll also look at the 12-month period to see if there's any durability of effects. So do we see any long-term outcomes once the cash transfers are removed? I often get questions about whether there are harmful effects of the cash transfers, and I think there's a fairly good body of evidence that people who receive a cash transfer don't spend them on alcohol and tobacco and sex. We're doing some qualitative work around this right now. And this is work done by Nancy Seisky, who's a doctoral student in the Epi division. But what we're seeing is that people in the cash group are actually using the money to buy food, to invest in productive assets, and to pay school fees. So they're making a choice about how they're going to spend the money. but we don't know yet if it's going to improve adherence or retention. And I just wanted to say that although we're excited about cash transfers today, and I'm very much excited about cash transfers in general, that there is a larger spectrum of ways to nudge people toward positive health behaviors. And so I've listed some of these on the slide that I'm interested in, but I think we can think a lot more beyond cash in terms of creative ways to nudge people. And in the context of sexual and reproductive health, this stuff is completely understudied. We know virtually nothing beyond some of the work that was presented today. So with that, I'll just thank all of my collaborators who've been involved in that very brief overview of what we're doing. Thank you.